Max Eagelfeld, 82nd Armored Medical Battalion, taking the interview on the 15th of August, 2008, Abilene, Texas, for the 12th Armored Division reunion. Well, Max, thank you for agreeing to sit down with us again. Technical difficulties made your last interview pretty much disappear, so we'd like to start again. And basically, pretty much as we had discussed before you entered the Army, what were you doing?
Before I entered the Army, I went to college full-time. And when I got a letter from the President, I was invited to join another organization, a little bit larger than my college school. And so I entered the Army in February 1943. And as I said yesterday, when I went into the service, I had very bad eyesight, which I still maintain. And the doctor said, well, if you can't see so good, we'll send you up to the front. You'll be able to see the enemy. Of course, he was joshing. However, he said, would you like to examine urine in Grand Central? Well, I said, yes, of course, why not? And that mollified my mother. When I told him, I said, no, I'm only going to be stationed right here in Grand Central Station. The next week we come in, and the sergeant lines us up, an MP lines us up and says, okay, you men, get in line and let's roll. And I naively raised my hand and said to him, I'm not supposed to be on this line. I'm supposed to be examining urine in Grand Central Station. Get in line! And had to obey. And it was the last time I saw it for about 18 months, till I got my first furlough. The staging area at Fort Dix in New Jersey. And from there, we were transported by train. Took 5 days on the train. And we had 2 men sleeping on the bottom and 1 on top. And the 2 men who were, they were buddies. And they always tried to convince me that it was better for them, for me to sleep on the bottom all the time. So I only got to sleep there once, where the other 2 got to sleep there more often than I did. But anyway, we finally did get to Camp Roberts. When we got to Camp Roberts, I was in infantry basic training. One of the fellows that went with me, I forgot to mention this yesterday, who went with me, he says, I'm going to get out. I said, hey, you'll never get out there. You're in the Army. Forget it. He said, I'll get out. Every day he went on sick call, complaining of his shoulder. He couldn't lift his shoulder. So he finally was so disgusted with him, they said, okay, you got your discharge. And as soon as he got his discharge, he runs around, hey, I'm going home. And suddenly was able to...
suddenly the shoulder was fine.
His shoulder was fine. Call about gold bricking. Anyway, I served. I did my basic training, and from there I was assigned to the anti-aircraft artillery, defending the naval base at Coronado. Had the Japanese intelligence found out that Eaglefeld was on duty, I am certain they would have attacked, because I couldn't tell a fly from a B-29 at that distance, because you were supposed to be able to recognize the plane and determine whether or not. However, we did have we didn't have any such problems. I remember something I didn't say yesterday, going on maneuvers one day, and and all of the guns were firing at the target. But what happened was that I happened to be sitting in standing in a certain spot where all of the noise seemed to collect right in that area, and I suddenly winced and I started running, and an officer came over and he said, "What's the matter, soldier?" I said, "That noise was horrible. I couldn't take it." He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. You'll be all right." Thank goodness it didn't. Nothing happened. But the plane came down. Now, why did the plane come down? He says, "I'm not going up there." The reason is that when you have an aircraft and the radar is tracking it, there's behind the aircraft, 200 yards behind them, is the actual target that the radar is supposed to be recognizing. Only this radar decided to recognize the plane, and it started firing at the plane. So he came down in a very quick maneuver, and he said, "I'm not going up there again." I think he had a perfect right for his beliefs. So uneventfully then, nothing much happened there, but then from there I applied for ASTP. And when I went to I applied, I noticed that other people who sent in applications after I did, they were accepted, and I wasn't. And one day, as luck would have it, I was stationed, I was on leave, and I see a sign, 4th Army Headquarters. I said, let me go in. I walk in, and I say to the desk sergeant, I said, sir, I'd like to see why I wasn't accepted into the ASTP program, because I applied and I have the high enough qualifications in order to attend the ASTP. So he says, oh, what's your name? I said, Eagelfeld. He said, oh, we're looking for you. I said, I'm here. He said, well, I'm going to cut orders immediately that you are to be dispatched to the ASTP program. And I was assigned to the New Mexico School of Mines. And I went in toward the end of 1943, and then in March of 1944, the entire program, except for a few men who were sent to either medical school or dental school, were permitted to take, because they gave you a test, and those who scored very high were able to go to medical school and dental school. But anyway, so what happened was that everybody from my school and from all of the local schools in Texas and New Mexico were sent to Camp Barkley. When I got to Camp Barkley, the one who interviewed me said, where do you want to go? I said, I'd like to go into the medics because I'm interested in the health field, and I'd like to be working with the medics. So he said, fine, you got it. And he assigned me to the 82nd Armored Medical Battalion, and I was in Company C. And I just happened to remember something. During training, there were some prisoners of war at Camp Barkley. And one day, I happened to be walking, and a soldier was guarding a prisoner, and as I walked by, somebody yelled to me, "Get out of there!" I said, "What? What's the matter?" So he says, "Oh, this wasn't the POW. This was a regular Army person who was incarcerated for whatever reason. But the rule was that if you prevented a guard from and the prisoner escaped, you would have to serve the prisoner's time." So luckily nothing happened, and I was able to get out of that area rather quickly, and so it was rather uneventful. As I say, I trained there at Barkley, but because we were the last ones to come in, those of us from ASTP, we were privates, and the other men from the cadre that was already there were sergeants and corporals, and that's why the so-called quiz kids or whiz kids were on the bottom of the pile, so to speak. However, I did whatever I had to do, and then because we were very well, scored very high on our maneuvers, because the team didn't have anybody from a medical detachment to determine how well we did. They had for infantry, for tanks, for artillery, so they found fault with everybody. But with the medics, they couldn't find fault because they didn't have anybody there. So we were given a special dispensation, and we got furloughs. And I get a furlough, and I get and as soon as I got home, I got a telegram. the telegram stated you have to report back in 6 days rather than 7. So I only lost a day. A friend of mine got from the same outfit, right? He got a telegram, come back immediately. And he had to go back, and so anyway, I came back, and as soon as I did come back, everybody in the barracks said, "Oh, you're going to get it because you're AWOL." I said, "No, I'm not. Here's the telegram. It says report by 6 a.m. and I was there at 5:55. I'll tell you why in just a second. And I went into the first sergeant. I showed him the telegram. He says, "Okay, you're on duty now," and that's it. Now the reason I got there, it says when I had gone home for the furlough, what happened was that I lost my ticket. I went to the MPs and at the Grand Central State, and I said, "I'm sorry, I lost my ticket." He says, "No problem." He gave me a ticket, except instead of the ticket going to the way I came, he gave me a ticket. I had to go to St. Louis, and from St. Louis down to some place in Texas, and I had to take the famous Texas and Pacific Railroad. Well, I did get back, but you realize how big Texas is when you take the Texas and Pacific Railroad. However, when I got on there, I looked and noticed that the train was segregated. There were blacks in the front, and the train was crowded, and they were standing. So I went into the next car, and I said, "See, half of the car is empty, almost completely empty." So I naively walk over to the conductor, and I said to him, "Why can't those people in the front come back here and let them sit down? Why do they have to stand in the front?" "Soldier, if you weren't in uniform, I'd put you off at the next station." I was just shocked by that. I mean, we had never faced that type of situation. So anyway, I got back to camp on time, and of course we got ready to go overseas. I was able to go home because we were at Camp Shanks. I went home on a miserable night, and I said to my father, "I don't know where I'm going, but do we have any relatives in England?" So he gave me the name of somebody, and I said, "Okay, maybe I'll look them up if I can." So we get on the boat on the Tasker H. Bliss, and on the Tasker H. Bliss, we had a number of outfits, of course, and there you were sleeping five in a bunk, of course, and luckily I never get seasick even now. I've never gotten seasick, so I didn't suffer. Some of the men did have problems, you know. In fact, it was funny when I saw a sailor heaving over the side, I said, "You're a sailor, you're not supposed to get seasick." He said, "Why not?" He said, I can get seasick. So anyway, when we headed out, we were told, "Well, you're not really going from New York. You're going from New York down to Norfolk, Virginia to pick up the rest of the convoy." So we had a convoy and picked up the rest of the ships, and we go sailing. In the middle of the ocean, there's a notice in the newsletter, "We're being followed by a wolf pack." And some of the men said, "Hey, did you hear? We're going the submarines are right out there. They're going to attack us." I says, "Look, you're in the safest place possible." He says, "What do you mean safest?" I says, "Look, torpedoes don't zigzag. Torpedoes go straight. Do you see how many ships there are before they get here? So don't worry about it." Yeah? And I said, furthermore, I said, "Do you see those little ships that are skidding around the outside? And you can't, they're pretty fast. Those are known as destroyers. And who do they destroy? U-boats." I said, "You're not going to see a U-boat commander willingly give up his life just to be able to get closer. He's going to stay a distance away if he thinks he's going to get killed." Because don't forget, if a U-boat sinks, nobody is ever saved. There's no chance of getting out alive. That includes anything from the top captain to the lowest survivor. But anyway, I said, that's the second. And the third thing is that there are 2 admirals on this ship, and the Navy won't let 2 admirals sink. So they finally laughed, and they said, and it sort of broke up the tension. Then I landed at least in a place called Bristol, England. I don't know, on some of your signs it says Liverpool. I think we landed at Bristol, and we went to the windiest place in England, known as Swindon. Nice little town 40 miles east of London. And when we got to London, we set up our barracks, and we continued training. And one day the captain said to me, I think you ought to get some medical training, so I'm sending you over to the hospital. There was a big general hospital there. So I said, okay, and I went over there. And after 2 days, I went to the captain. I said, you told me I'm going to learn how to do medical work. I says, they're not showing me any medical work. He said, what do you mean? He says, all I'm doing is pushing a broom. He says, no, you weren't sent for that. I said, well, that's what he has me doing, because the colonel in charge was a stickler for cleanliness. And he thought I was just being sent over just so. The very next day, after the captain must have spoken to somebody there, the very next day they said, go around with this nurse and she'll tell you what to do. So I walk around with her, and as we stop at one soldier's bed, she says, okay, take out blood. I said, what do you mean? She says, go ahead, stick them in a vein and take out the blood. I said, but I've never done it. She says, don't worry, go ahead and do it. So I'm sticking and sticking and sticking. 6 sticks I got some for, and she says, okay, I'll do it. So and the soldier didn't wince or say anything. He may have uttered words internally, but externally he didn't say boo. So I was glad that experience was over, and I really didn't learn anything that I had to know from my combat experience. So when we got into combat, well then we, as I said yesterday, we went on the boat, on a landing ship, and we were on the first landing ship tank, LSTs, to go up the river, and we wound up at Rouen, and we wound up in Rouen. I said, let me write a letter, but I won't mention the name Rouen. I said, this is the town where Joan of Arc was sacrificed on a pyre because she led the French army over the English. And I said, and the captain called me, he said, this is a beautiful letter, but you can't send this letter. I said, why not? I said, I didn't mention the name of the, he says, but anybody reading the letter knows where it is. So be that as it may, we wound up, he sent the letter, but they crossed out whatever they thought would be advantageous to the enemy. Had they captured it or stolen it. But anyway, from there we were sent further down into the 7th Army area, and we were attached to General Patch's 7th Army, and we went into combat about the first day about my birthday, around November 30th, maybe a few days more, a few days less, somewhere around there. And on the first night, I remember we slept outside, but after that, we asked the people if we could take a room, and I did have a room in somebody's house, and we all slept. And that night, shells started, the artillery started firing. And as the artillery was firing, this building was shaking, and we were all sleeping, but the shell came so close to the house. It didn't hit the house, but it came so close and hit very close nearby, it shook the building rather severely because the chandelier came down. And as the chandelier came down, all of the other men got up except me. When I got up in the morning, they all said, are you all right? I said, fine. What's the matter? What happened? He said, didn't you hear the chandelier fall? I said, when I sleep, I don't hear anything. So they said, boy, oh boy, you really must have slept hard, because we can't imagine somebody not hearing a big chandelier falling down. I said, well, I didn't hear it, and that was that. So anyway, at that particular time, we, as I say, we were in that town, and in France, we never took out we told the people to leave. They could stay in there, and if they wanted to give us a room, fine. If they didn't, we looked elsewhere. But everybody was able to be in a room, fortunately. So, and we set up our hospital bed. In fact, we had a complete surgical truck that was never used, not even once. And yet it had a complete surgical equipment and a table and everything that could be used, right? But absolutely never used once. We would always set up in some kind of a school or church or somewhere else, a large room where we could take all our equipment and handle all the wounded. So, so my first job there was to make sure to walk around with the captain and just mark the medical tags to mark the diagnosis that the doctor would put out. And as luck would have it, unfortunately, more men suffered from trench foot and frostbite than from enemy wounds. But we still had to take care of these people. And if you got, the doctor would say, let's call this trench foot, let's call that frostbite, because you couldn't tell. The toes were blue anyway, but there is a difference. One, the trench foot is caused by the accumulation of water in your socks and shoes, and that shrivels the toes to begin with. And then frostbite is just severe cold itself. So for frostbite, you got a Purple Heart, but for trench foot, you didn't. Why? Because according to the Army, you were supposed to get a fresh pair of socks, take off the old socks. They didn't bother to tell you that you didn't have a quartermaster there to give you anything. So unfortunately, some people got Purple Hearts and other people didn't. But be that as it may, I did my job at that time, and I remember one fellow coming in with with a wound on his finger. So what happened? He said, well, I cut myself on a sea ration can. I said, okay, you jumping for a foxhole, you got here. So we put a Band-Aid on. I said, go over there. I said, you're eligible for a Purple Heart. Whether your whole insides are all out or you just get a little flesh wound, it's the same thing, Purple Heart. So anyway, we did. I did that for a couple of days. Worked with the doctor. Suddenly, same doctor who I would be walking with says, "Eagelfeld, you're going to do something else." I said, "What?" He says, "You're in charge of making sure that these men eat, because to me it's important that anybody who's here while the mess is going on, that they be an opportunity to eat. After all, you don't know when, because between our unit and which was a combat command aid station, which is right near, just a few miles from the front, and the base hospital could be as much as 50 to 100 miles. So if somebody was there and the other ambulance unit that was attached to the base hospital coming to our unit, if they weren't there, we had to take care of these people. But be that as it may, I went over to the mess sergeant. I said, I need 30 or 40 mess kits filled with food. He says, I can't give you that. Wait till I'm finished. When I'm finished, I'll give you the food. So maybe that was one of the reasons why the other fellow didn't want to say anything. So I turned around, I walked over to Captain Campbell, and I said, Captain, the mess sergeant says he's not going to give me any food until the men of the company eat first. He says, come with me. Goes over to the mess sergeant. He said, Sergeant, you give this man every drop of food you have. Even if it means that we starve, you give him if it ever happens that you do not give him any food and he reports it to me, you will be standing so far close to the enemy that the enemy will be able to see you and you will be able to see the enemy's whites of their eyes. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. P.S. I never had trouble again. In fact, I was such a chow hound, I used to eat with the wounded men, and then I ate when the company ate. I ate twice. Didn't charge the government anything for it. So that was my job, officially. But as wounded men came in, as German prisoners of war came in, I was the only one who was actually being able to talk to them. Other men were busy with taking care of their wounds or doing something medically or just writing up reports and everything like that. But I was able to just, when I wasn't giving out food, I was able to talk to the men. And of course, and one of the things I was inquisitive about is that we had heard that we were up against an SS division. In fact, there were 6 SS divisions at one time. But I used to call and I would ask the men, raise up your sleeve, and they didn't want to do it at first. I said, raise up your sleeve, and they did obey, and I saw them, and I tried to find out why. And subsequently, I did find out the reason they didn't want to show the tattoo with the number on it was because they were afraid, because they were told that Goebbels had said that if they give up or if they surrender, they will be shot by us, and we weren't. Of course, you remember the Malmedy massacre, where the Germans shot the Americans during the Battle of the Bulge. But we didn't. I gave the German prisoners of war the same food as I gave the American wounded soldiers. And then, of course, we sent them on to the base hospitals because we couldn't take the wounded, because we had to send our ambulances to the front to get others. And so that remained my position as we went through. And of course, at the Battle of Heroldsheim, we handled 109 wounded men. And one of the men who was in a company where I knew one of my buddies was, a fellow by the name of Bob Kane. And I asked him, how's Bob Kane doing? He said, oh, he was killed. And I said, oh, gee, I'm sorry, because I had asked Bob before when he went in. I said, what outfit are you going to, Bob? He says, oh, they put me in the infantry because I didn't say. So why didn't you tell them what you wanted? He says, nah, whatever they gave me. I said, so it was one of these unfortunate, he was a very nice fellow. But unfortunately, at Heroldsheim, one wounded soldier came in with comminuted fractures of both femurs, and he said, you think I'll make it, Doc? I looked at him and I said, oh, sure you will. And I turned around and shed a tear. And when I turned back, he was dead. And very few men died. I mean, people killed on the battlefield, you know, but when somebody, very rarely did someone die. Because we actually didn't do too much treatment there because you didn't have time. We had doctors there, but they couldn't really treat. They were like advanced aid men. So the real surgery that was done at the base hospitals. But one day, somebody came up with amputated legs, and he's bleeding profusely. And the doctor said, we've got to give him a transfusion. Does anybody want to volunteer? At first, nobody said anything. He said, well, anybody volunteers, we'll give you as much ethyl alcohol as you want. And all of a sudden, Eddie Ferrin raised up, oh, of course, I'll give it. Eddie, as you can well recognize, was an alcohol, must have been 0.8 blood in his whenever he could get it. But anyway, the unfortunate part of this particular incident is that they had the equipment, the blood, but they didn't know how to give a transfusion. They were kept arguing amongst themselves. Do you know how to do it? Do you know how to do it? And they're reading the labels on the bottle because many of these doctors were general practitioners at home who had never given a transfusion, didn't know how to do it, but yet they were obligated to do this. Well, somehow it worked, and they were able to at least send them off to the base hospital. What happened after that, of course, we don't know. And so those were some of the incidents, of course, that I witnessed. And of course, we, after that, we did go into the Colmar pocket. My recollection of it is that as the 82nd, we weren't directly involved, except, of course, for our wounded soldiers. And I do know that because of the situation that developed, that we were going to be pulled back, and as a result, the French Army, we were under the French Army at that time. The French Army really wanted the 12th to stay there, and I'm sure other people have told you this story, and allegedly Eisenhower wanted our division to pull back, but the French, and they had 6 divisions of their own, but they wanted the 12th also along with them. And we didn't, even though we suffered many casualties, we did stay and fight. And as I say, we did have our work cut out for us at that time, and from a medical point of view. But we persevered, and we were able to energize ourselves, so to speak, and reorganize into a good combat force, and we didn't have to retreat, at least not too far at that time. So that, of course, then came the crossing of the Rhine. And when we crossed the Rhine, that's why we're known as the Mystery Division. Patton took us over. I'm sure everybody knows that story. And we were known as the Mystery Division. And so we had to take off our patches because Patton didn't want the enemy to know that he had another armored division there. So, as I say, we went over some large pontoon bridge, and there's a famous picture. Like somebody just showed it to my son today, of Pat crossing the Rhine and urinating in it. I'm sure others have told you about that. But be that as may. And as we get into the first house in Germany, because I spoke some German, I was dispatched to be the one here in Germany to tell the people to get out of their houses, and we were going to take over. So I had a very special speech made up, and the speech went like this: you have 15 minutes to get out of the house. You can take all your food, all your clothing, but you must leave the bedding. And in one German house, they said to me, where are we going to go? I said, well, you might ask the German soldiers who went into France and Russia, if they were asked such a question, what they did. And not a single one ever said no to me. In fact, in one area, where there's an old man and an old lady and a very young, good-looking girl, and when I gave them the same story, they came back 15 minutes later, and the house was clear as the driven snow, as though a moving company had come in and just wiped it, taken everything out. I said, where's the bedding? He said, well, we have to have some place to sleep too. I said, I told you, you have to leave the bedding. Go back and get it now. Of course they did so, because they didn't know what we were going to do. And so these things happen from time to time, and we did, and this was something that, but this wasn't an official duty. This was more, I still had to take care of my responsibilities. But in addition, this was part of my responsibility to take care of it, tell the people to get out of their houses, and that's it. And we were able to maneuver in a better, and of course we also used larger places for our surgical setup so that we could put down the litters that we needed and things like that. And as I said, these things, as we progressed and we were going through Germany much faster than we thought we would, there were times that we were so far ahead, and there's an apocryphal story that in one area, the two generals were meeting, and the general said, "I'm going to be shelling that town tomorrow." And our general said to him, "Just be careful. We have advanced units past that, and we have other units in that town already." He said, "What?" He says, "Yeah, we have advanced units where you're going to shell, so be careful where you put your shells." So we were able to move, and I noticed that many of the infantry battalions, or not our infantry, but the regular infantry divisions, we were with the 36th for a while, they had to use captured German vehicles. Well, the only unfortunate thing with the German vehicles is that they didn't have a reverse gear. I guess Hitler decided that they were only going to advance. So it's like I used to hear on the German radio, "We are advancing to the rear to consolidate our positions." They never said they were being pushed back. They were consolidating positions. Of course, until the end of the war, they continued to consolidate when there was nothing more to consolidate. And of course, as all people know, we actually crossed into Dillingen, Germany, and by that time, the end of April, actually it only took us a month to go from one end of Germany through all of southern Bavaria, and to get to, by maybe 5 weeks, from March 23rd until about the last week in April, when we discovered the death camps. And of course, I told you about the horrors that these people face, as you have them out here, and the stories that were told. And the Dr. Phibbs, who will be here tomorrow night, had dispatched one of the doctors, a Jewish doctor, to help help these people as much as they could. Came back, and he was crying viciously, and he was so overwhelmed that he was sick. He said, "I can't take it." And of course they sent another doctor, because some of the soldiers who tried to help them, the people were so emaciated, as it points out there, that they died just from eating a small amount of food, because their body just couldn't accept it. Some of these people weighed as little as 70 and 80 pounds. Men who had probably been 200 or 150 pounds at least were down to skin, literal skin and bones. And this was a shocking experience. And one of the worst disasters, as part of that, they had literally pushed people into buildings and burnt the buildings down, so that the people would be they could kill as many as there were no gas ovens there. So in order to kill them faster, they herded them all together, locked them in there, and burnt the buildings down. It was a horrible situation. Those men who were frontline troops, they said that even though they were in combat, they said this is the worst thing they saw during the war. And this is the news that we got, of course. And so there were many horror stories that you heard from other men. And of course, when May 6th came around, we pulled back, and we pulled back toward a place called near Ulm. And as luck would have it, I was placed Our company was in a place near the largest DP camp in Europe. So the people, but they did have a center for them to come. So what happened is that what I did is I walked over to the place and I said, does anybody here need any help in finding people? And I said, I'd be glad to help anybody who requires it. And people started talking to me. Many of them had relatives but they did not correspond with them before the war, and certainly during the war they certainly couldn't correspond, and so they would give me addresses that my father couldn't find even when he went to the fire department. Usually the fire department keeps records of all the buildings, and so I couldn't help those people at all. You tell me that.
Keep going.
Where were we?
The displaced persons camp.
The
trying to find addresses.
right. And trying to find addresses, and those who gave me legitimate addresses, we hooked up with those people, and my father was able to take care of contacting these people, and some families were able to bring their relatives over. I was given a book of 50,000 names. He said, if your name is in this book, then it's a Holocaust survivor. But unfortunately, I didn't find anybody from my father's family. But I did try to help these other people. One funny incident that happened is a man said, I'm looking for my relatives. I said, well, what's his name? Oh, his name is Cohen. I said, okay, well, where does he live? He lives in Brooklyn. I said, where in Brooklyn? He said, you don't know Cohen in Brooklyn? So I had to explain to him that there are about 7 pages of Cohens. See, that's one of the advantages of having an odd name. Because, as an aside, I was able to find a relative that my father didn't even know about just by looking in a London telephone book. That brings up another story. When we were in England, I visiting my relatives there, and I suddenly heard a buzz bomb, one of the first V-2 rockets to be fired. And I said, well, what do you do? He said, oh, nothing. I said, what do you mean nothing? Don't you see, sure. He says, it's too late. And a few seconds later, you hear a loud boom. They weren't direct. It's not like the ICBMs that we have today that can be pinpointed. Those rockets, they didn't know where. It was a question of where it was aimed, how much fuel it had, and everything else that determined where it was. But it had no significant military value. But it certainly put you on notice, and you didn't know where you were going to live today or tomorrow. In other words, these people had to live, the British people had to live under the aegis of having a situation where they had to know that any day for 5 years they could be killed. Not like 9/11 here. And I often wondered as to how we would react to a situation. 9/11 was our situation, but be that as it may, the British people acted with restraint and ability to observe the rules of civilization and just keep going as much as they did. They had complaints, of course, but one of their complaints was that they had to eat powdered eggs and powdered milk, which probably tasted terrible, but it was food. And he was still eating far better than the French people. But anyway, when the buzz bomb fell down and they didn't do anything, and I was rather surprised at that, yet there was nothing that they could do. And yet life went on. I remember going onto a bus, double-decker bus in London, and I was going to Royal Albert Hall for a concert. They had a concert on, and it was crowded. But the buses, I got on a bus, and the conductor says, there are no seats. So in New York, you cram people as much as you can, but now this is wartime. Thousands of people have to go to them, but everybody waited. And the people were shocked when I jumped on a bus. And he said, I can't start the bus while you're here. We have to wait for the next bus. So even during the war, they observed there, even when they were waiting for rations. I would see people waiting for hours just to get whatever rations they could for their family. They were certainly deserving of our appreciation for their fortitude and just trying to get through the day, because somebody, I can't imagine Americans just standing calmly by for hours and hours online, waiting just to get some bits of food. Of course, I know there was rationing here, but nothing like what they had in London. And so I did appreciate British fortitude at that time. And but there were a couple of other incidents. One day I went to visit someone in a small town who was a relative of my father's attorney, and I went to visit, and I stopped off at the hotel, and I said, "A reservation under Eaglefeld?" He said, "Yes." He says, and he looks at me, he said, "But I thought you were an officer." I said, "What difference does it make?" I says, I'm here, and I'm going to make sure that I want to see these people here." And that's he said, reluctantly, but he sounded reluctant, but he said, okay. It wasn't going to be that discourteous and turn me away, but he obviously had a look of displeasure, and so, but he did, and I saw these people, and very nice, and I spent the evening with them, and I went back to my barracks. One of the good things about the English is that they permitted American troops to go anywhere in England that they want, free of charge. Just get on a train, but you had to tell them how far you wanted to go. I said, fine. What's the northernmost top of England? So I find Loch Ness. So I said, let's go to Loch Ness. And that's where I found out the beginnings of the Loch Ness story. And when I went up there, I had met a Scotsman, and I said, "What's the story with this Loch Ness? Do you really have a monster here?" He says, "I don't know if we do or we don't, but it sure brings a lot of people." And we wound up one day, I wound up in Glasgow, and I asked the conductor, "Where can I go around here?" He says, "Take that little trolley there." I said, "Okay." I said, "Is there anything out there?" He says, "No, you go all the way to the end of the line." I said, "You go to the end of the line?" I said, "Well, what's at the end of the line?" "Oh," he says, "Nothing there, but it's only threepence halfpenny. In other words, it's only 3.5 cents, but you're getting a big ride." So I came back. I said, "All right." So I went on the trolley. He came back, but they gave me a slice of Scots life. I mean, I realized the Scots and the English are different somehow, but I like both of them, and it's recognized in the way I talk about them. And I visited England and Scotland a number of times subsequently, but I'm going to confine my remarks to what happened actually during the war. Okay, go ahead.
One more question, or one more story that I want to get you to repeat from yesterday is a story of that Walther PPK pistol we have out on display, and how we came to find out that it belonged to Adolf Eichmann.
One day, I was at the Eastern Chapter meeting, and I was walking through the door, and there was a woman who was wheeling her father through the door, and said, "Thank you very much for holding the door for me." And she says, "Oh, my father was the one who captured Eichmann." I said, "What?" She said, "Yes, he captured Eichmann." I never heard about this before, and I said, "I'd like to speak to you." And he said, "Fine." And I went over and I spoke to him, and he told me the story of how they got Eichmann. there was a parade of tanks going through, and there's three German soldiers and 2 women standing on the side there, and one of the men noticed that they were carrying guns, and of course they liberated the guns immediately, and said, and started talking to them. And as they spoke to them, they noticed that the one dressed as a lieutenant, another dressed as a captain, were always referring to the guy who was dressed as a corporal. So he became suspicious. He said, yeah, it's kind of funny. And so he had all 3 sent back to Division Headquarters G2. And G2 obviously queried them, but not deep enough. So these men were let go. One of these men turned out to be Eichmann. Now, how do we know that? He said that, and I said, how do you know that that was the man you captured? He said, because I recognized him, because when Israel captured him and took him back to Israel, he was on top of it, and that was the man that I had seen. And the other proof was that someone had the gun. And I just saw that it's a classmate of mine, Harold Sarles, and one of his relatives happened to be the one who got the gun. I think this man gave the gun to and he held it. And I said, "What are you going to do with it?" He says, I don't know. I'll probably give it away or something." I said, "Why don't you give it to the museum?" He said, "Okay." So I got in touch with Johnny Christus, and then I said, "We have the gun that Eichmann used. We want to make sure of it, and let's try to get it." And he obviously informed the postal authorities that there was a gun that was to be shipped, of course, without ammunition. And he said, "Okay, go ahead." And I shipped the gun, and the gun was shipped here. And Johnny Christus saw the label and saw a identifying number for the gun. And of course, it was a Walther pistol, so he contacted the pistol company that made the gun, and he said, "Who was this gun sold to?" And the gun was actually sold. It wasn't bought by the German. Most of these guns were bought by the German army for their use. But this particular gun was sold to Adolf Eichmann, or given somehow, and they had the. In other words, when the army buys a gun, it doesn't say this gun belongs to General so-and-so or Colonel so-and-so. But this gun was deliberately assigned to Adolf Eichmann, right? And so that's how we proved that this gun belonged to Eichmann. That's why it's here in the museum. And you're able to display it. And I was rather surprised that he was able to authenticate this. So that we do have proof of that. Unfortunately, the Israelis would not have had to go after him for 7 years had our intelligence been able to discern that Adolf Eichmann was the individual who was dressed as a corporal, you know? So that was the situation with regard to that. Now, if there are there are a number of other little things I'm sure that I have. I just want to look through and make sure I got everything that I wanted to say on here. And just give me a moment here,
no
would
problem.
you please, to look through. Just little anecdotes here. We were talking before about the French. One day, we were still in Alsace-Lorraine. The house that we were in, was getting muddy because of the weather, and a man would come out and sweep it. And 2 minutes later, we would come by and track the mud again. And that's all he kept doing, just pushing the mud back and forth to straighten it out. So what happens is he goes in for lunch after a hard day's work, of course. Goes in for lunch and he says, he looks at the table, "Where's my lunch?" So I happened to be there, and I said to him, I said, "Your wife took care of the chickens, she took care of the pigs, she fed the children, she cleaned the house, she did everything else while you're just sitting there with the broom." I said, "She didn't stop a minute." So you can't wait for your meal? The woman just backed away, and she had a look of saying, "Boy, I'm glad somebody else said something to him," you know. He looked at me. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me as if to say, "What do you mean?" You know. So he backed off. Then another time, while we were in, I think it was one of the other houses, and we had to take care of our ablutions, and I did. And I told him, you know, in America we have special paper for this. He runs over to his wife. He says, mon Dieu, en Amérique, pour la paper spécial pour la toilette. You know, special paper for the toilet. They had never heard of it. And this was back in 1944. And in this particular town, they never even heard of it. So that was one of the funny incidents there. And let's see. Oh yeah, one of my friends had a typewriter he wanted to sell. Now you wouldn't give 2 cents for that typewriter here, but things were so desperate there in Europe. He gives me a typewriter that has no, some of the keys don't work, and those that do work don't work too well. And he says to me, "You get $75. Anything over $75 you keep." So I take the typewriter from, and I carried it all the way into Paris, and I indicate that I'm selling something here. So a man comes over to me. Now, he obviously must have been a black marketeer, because how many people had $125 in those days? That was a lot of money. Don't forget, he'd just been freed. He said, "How much?" And he was there with his daughter. And she obviously wanted the typewriter, because he said, "How much do you want?" I said, $125. And he tried to bargain with me. I said, "No, I know what my parameters were, and I knew what I had to give back the other guy." So I said, "This is $125, or the equivalent in whatever money he had that I could transfer into $125. And his daughter looks at him longingly, with a weepish, sheepish look in her eyes. He wants it desperately. So I knew I made the sale. And I did make the sale, and he gave me $125. So as I say, obviously a black marketeer. Because actually when I was overseas, I'll be honest to admit it, I sold cigarettes. I didn't smoke cigarettes, so I sold them. I was able to live on $2 a month, and all the rest went back home. That's how I was able to open up my own office as a result of the money that I got. Let's see, now, oh yeah, one time I was sent up as a combat medic, and luckily there was not too much action at that time, except one situation developed. We were going the night from one place to another, and in the morning a soldier said, "Doc, what should I do? I got diarrhea." I said, "Okay." I said, "When did it happen?" He said, "What happened last night?" I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You're walking around with it all day?" He said, "Yeah." So I said, "I wish you would have told me when it happened, because I have paregoric here. I would have given you some paregoric." That's what they used in those days. And that was the extent of my necessary aid man's work, because I didn't have to take care of any wounded soldier. But they treated me with a great deal of respect. "Doc, anything we can do for you?" The only unfortunate thing is I had a nice big bedroll. I would remember I was telling you, I don't know if I mentioned about the time somebody went up to get some supplies. He wound up at the supply dump. This was a fellow who originally did not have too many brain cells working upstairs, but he did manage to do something for the company. How did he do it? He went over to the dump and to the quartermaster supply camp, and they asked him, "What papers do you have?" He mentions an outfit. He said, "Well, we don't have you on here." He said, "Oh, we know all about it because we ran out of stuff." So the MP on duty says, "Look, I'll give you 15 minutes to go in there, get what you want, but if you're not out in the 15 minutes, you're a dead dog." He starts grabbing everything as fast as he could. And they raffle off, and he brings it back. And this is a guy, well, they had an altercation with, but that's for a later story. He comes back, and he had gotten all of this stuff, but when he enlisted, he was drafted, and they gave out the supplies. They threw out a pair of socks at him, and he says, "What these for?" He came from a part of Kentucky where socks were strange, or maybe at least to him they were. So it shows the level of the mentality of the guy. But he brought back all of these things, and I was lucky enough to get a big bedroll. Only it was heavy, but I was able to carry it. What did I carry in there besides the things I really needed? I carried books, believe it or not. I was carrying books on poetry even, carrying from place to place. But anyway, we got these things, and one of my friends didn't get anything, but the officer said, "We want the plates," and he said, and he raised his hand, he said, "We think it should be done the way the bedrolls were done, by lottery, but the officers should apply for the lottery the same way the enlisted men are." And the officer said, no, we're entitled to apply. And you know, in a battle between an officer and a private, who's going to win that battle? So obviously the officers won the battle, and unfortunately this fellow was sent packing. He became an aide man, and but everything was all right with him because he eventually became a doctor himself, and I still correspond with him. But I said, "Boy, you took a chance when you did," because I had told him at that time. I said, "You can't argue with these guys. Look what they did to you." So anyway, he did manage to survive the war without being injured, thank goodness, and he served society very well. But as I say, I did carry a big bedroll. In fact, I had, after the war was over, I went to a place called Scrivener American University. This is during the time that after the war is over, but we weren't being sent home. So we were allowed to go to this American University, and I went to Scrivener American University. But what had happened is that I collected so much stuff in my duffel bag that I could barely get it over because we were coming by ship to the English port. So I tried to lift. I couldn't even pick it up. I asked another guy to come over, big, heavy, husky guy. I said, "Could you help me with this?" And he tried to lift it. He said, "What do you got in here?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "But all I know is I can't carry it." He tried to pick it up. He said, "Oh, this is too heavy to take down." So I made an immediate decision. I said, "Well, I'm going to take the bull by the horns." And I took this big duffel bag, crammed to the gills, and I picked it up, and with all my strength at that time, I picked it up and threw it over the side, taking a chance because if it landed down beneath, I'd have absolutely nothing. But as luck would have it, it landed on the dock, and I was able to go from there. But anyway, I went to Scrivener University, and it was very nice. In fact, I got credit for some of the courses that I took there. toward my degree when I went back to college. So that was one of the other experiences that I didn't discuss yesterday, and I think I discussed just about all of the things that we had available. Let's see if I got everything there. Yeah. Oh, just one more little thing about that involves one other person. A few years ago, I visited the Jewish War Veterans Museum in Washington, and I saw a little article with a blurb on it with a name that I recognized. I went to school with a certain fellow named Marvin Dorff. And I said, gee, what's Marvin's name? Turns out he wound up in the 92nd Cavalry. And why was his name in the Jewish War Museum? Well, what happened is that he got wind of the fact that the Germans had a slave labor camp. I mean, were taking some slave laborers from some camp to another camp, and he said he asked his captain if he could go over and try to liberate these people. The captain said, "Okay, if anybody wants to." He couldn't order him to do it. He asked for volunteers, and just one of my friends who still a member of the association, Nick Paponi, went on this mission. They overpowered the guards, and they opened the doors, and 3,000 people were able to be saved as a result. And I called his wife, because unfortunately Marvin is suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and I wrote up the whole story of what happened, because we had been together in public school. I hadn't known in the Bronx. I hadn't known or seen him since I was in school until the 6th grade. And I remember him, one of the few people I remember from public school. And I was very happy that I did, but unfortunately, as I say, I didn't want to take the credit for this or anything. I just simply wanted to relate the story, so I just simply wrote it up as a story and gave him the credit. But they found out, and his story is in the Holocaust Museum today. In fact, when I visited the Holocaust Museum, I took a picture, and I was holding the flag, and they said, "Oh, you can't hold the flag." I said, "That flag belongs to our division. We fought for it, and I think we have a right to hold it, to take a picture of it." And so we did. So I wanted to make sure that I covered enough of the other subjects. I may have left out some of the things that I said yesterday, but I added a few things today. And I hope that you are able to utilize this for your purposes in any way you wish to. Thank
Max,
you.
I want to thank you so much for sitting down with me. A pleasure.